I never thought my first day at university would turn into a complete disaster. But here we are. Everyone around me was buzzing about one thing, and one thing only. Dax Rivers, the campus's most infamous enigma. People were practically falling over themselves just to catch a glimpse of him, like he was some kind of celebrity instead of just another student who happened to be born into the right dynamic. Whispers followed his name like a shadow. Did you hear what he did last weekend? Someone said he got into a fight with 3 alphas and didn't even break a sweat. His family owns half the city. He's never dated anyone, not seriously. Do you think he's waiting for someone? Do you think that someone could be me? I rolled my eyes internally and kept my head down. Me? I was just trying to find my classroom without making a scene. My hoodie pulled low over my face because my omega scent felt unusually strong today. I'd taken my scent blockers this morning, double-checked the dosage like I always did, but paranoia still crept up my spine like cold fingers. What if someone noticed? What if they figured out what I was and decided I was easy prey? The thought alone made my stomach twist into knots so tight I could barely breathe. I'd survived growing up in an underfunded orphanage where omegas were treated like bargaining chips. I'd clawed my way to a full scholarship at this prestigious university through sheer determination, sleepless nights, and a stubborn refusal to let my biology define my future. I wasn't about to let it all fall apart on day one because my suppressants decided to be unreliable. So I walked faster. Head down, hood up, invisible. That was the goal anyway. The universe had other plans. When I finally found the lecture hall and pushed through the heavy doors, the entire room went silent. Not the kind of quiet where people are politely ignoring you. The kind where every single head turns in your direction, and you can feel the weight of 30-plus pairs of eyes boring into your skin like brants. My cheeks burned under the attention. Great. Exactly what I wanted. The spotlight. There was only one empty seat left, right in the middle of the room. And sitting next to that empty seat, Dax Rivers himself. You have got to be kidding me. He looked exactly like the rumors described. Sharp jawline that could cut glass. Cold gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Dark hair artfully messy in that way that probably took 45 minutes to achieve but looked effortless. And an aura of dominance that practically radiated off him in waves. The kind of presence that made everyone else in the room seem small by comparison. He wasn't even doing anything. Just sitting there, scrolling through his phone like he was bored with the entire concept of education. I considered standing in the back. I really did. I'd done it before in high school when I wanted to disappear. But the professor had already noticed me standing there like a deer in headlights and was gesturing impatiently toward the empty seat with a look that said I don't get paid enough for this. My heart hammered against my ribs as I made my way down the aisle, hyper-aware of every eye following my movement, of the whispers that started up again, quieter now, but somehow worse. Who is that? Never seen him before. Is he an Omega? I can't quite tell. Next to Dax, poor guy doesn't stand a chance. I slid into the seat as quietly as possible, keeping my gaze fixed straight ahead. The desk was worn smooth by years of students before me. I focused on that, on the grain of the wood, on anything except the living legend sitting less than 2 feet away from me. Dax didn't even glance in my direction. He was completely absorbed in whatever he was writing in his notebook, his handwriting sharp and precise, like everything else about him. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. At least he's not going to make this weird. At least I can just sit here, take notes, and get through this class without any drama. That relief lasted exactly 15 minutes. Halfway through the professor's explanation of cellular biology, something about mitochondrial DNA and inherited traits that I was actually kind of interested in, Dax suddenly turned his head toward me. His movement was so abrupt that I flinched. My pencil skittered across my notebook, leaving a jagged black line across my notes that looked like a lie detector test during an anxiety attack. "You breathe really loudly," he said. His voice was low enough that only I could hear, but sharp enough to cut, like a knife wrapped in velvet. "It's annoying." My mouth fell open in disbelief. Was he serious right now? I've been sitting here minding my own business, taking notes, breathing like a normal person, and he had the audacity to complain about it. The way I breathe? I tried to calm the instant surge of anger that flooded through me. Tried to remember that arguing with an enigma, especially one as powerful as Dax Rivers, was generally a terrible idea. My Omega instinct screamed at me to apologize, to submit, to make this go away before it became a problem I couldn't solve. But I didn't. Something inside me, something stubborn and reckless and probably self-destructive, refused to back down. Instead, I turned to face him fully, met those cold gray eyes with as much confidence as I could muster, even though my hands were shaking under the desk. "And you're incredibly entitled," I said. "That's annoying, too." For a split second, his eyes widened in what looked like genuine shock. His mouth opened slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe someone had just talked back to him. The pen stopped moving in his hand. The casual arrogance slipped, just for a moment, and I saw something underneath that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe no one ever had before. Maybe everyone else at this university was too intimidated or too starstruck to tell Dax Rivers exactly what they thought of his attitude. Well, I wasn't everyone else. I turned back to my notebook and pretended to take notes for the rest of the class, even though my heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Dax didn't look at me again, didn't say another word, but I could feel the weight of his presence beside me like a physical thing, a gravitational pull that made my skin prickle and my Omega instinct sit up and pay attention in ways I absolutely did not appreciate. The rest of the class passed in tense silence. When the professor finally dismissed us, I gathered my things as quickly as possible, shoved my notebook into my bag, zipped it up with shaking fingers, desperate to get out of there and put some distance between myself and the most arrogant person I'd ever met. I made it to the doorway before I let myself breathe again. But as I stepped out into the hallway, something prickled at the back of my neck. That feeling of being watched, of being followed. I turned around, and there he was. Dax stood about 10 feet away, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth that made him look both dangerous and infuriatingly attractive. Students streamed past him on either side, giving him a wide berth like he was a shark, and they were all very sensible fish. "Which pack do you belong to?" he asked. His tone was casual, but his eyes were intense, gray and cold and watching. "I'll make sure to contact them by tomorrow. You should know there are consequences for disrespecting me." My blood boiled. Who did this guy think he was? I adjusted the strap of my bag, then walked straight toward him, closed the distance until I was close enough to smell his expensive cologne, something dark and woodsy that made my Omega senses go haywire in a way I absolutely did not appreciate. "Go ahead and try," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. "I don't belong to any pack, and your threats don't scare me. Not even a little bit." I turned on my heel and walked away, forced myself not to look back, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much that encounter had shaken me. Because the truth was, my hands were trembling as I pushed through the exit doors. My breath was coming too fast. Adrenaline was still flooding my system like a drug I couldn't metabolize fast enough. I just challenged an enigma, one of the most powerful dynamics in our society. I'd stood up to Dax Rivers on my very first day of university. That was either the biggest mistake I'd ever made or the bravest thing I'd ever done. Maybe both. As I walked across campus toward my tiny apartment off the edge of school grounds, I couldn't shake the image of his face from my mind. That moment of surprise when I talked back to him. The way his smirk had shifted into something more calculating, more interested. like I'd just become a puzzle he wanted to solve. I pushed the thought away and focused on the familiar path home, on the comfort of my own space, where I could finally relax and let my guard down, where I wouldn't have to worry about arrogant enigmas or their ridiculous power plays. But even as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, kicking off my shoes and dropping my bag by the door with a sigh of relief, I couldn't quite convince myself that this was over. Something told me that my encounter with Dax Rivers was just the beginning of something much more complicated than I was ready for. Something that would change everything about my carefully planned, quietly anonymous university experience. I just didn't know how right I was. The next morning, I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped onto campus. People were staring at me. Not just casual glances, the kind you give someone when you're trying to figure out if you know them from somewhere. These were full-on stares, accompanied by whispers behind hands and poorly concealed pointing. The kind of attention that made my skin crawl and my flight instinct scream run. My stomach sank as I made my way toward my first class, trying to ignore the attention but feeling it like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. Like someone had draped a lead blanket over me and expected me to just keep walking. What happened? What did I do? I replayed every interaction from yesterday. The classroom. The hallway. The way I'd told Dax Rivers that his threats didn't scare me. Oh no. Oh no. By lunchtime, I'd figured out what was going on. Dax had apparently told his extensive fan club about our encounter. Not the whole truth, not the part where he started it by complaining about my breathing. Just the part where I disrespected him, framing it as some kind of insult that I dared to speak to him the way I had. The rumor mill had done the rest. Some nobody Omega told Dax Rivers off. Can you believe the audacity? I heard he thinks he's special. Someone should put him in his place. Fantastic. Now I was officially a target, marked as the Omega who had the audacity to challenge the great Dax Rivers. I sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich I no longer had any appetite for, and tried to remind myself that I'd survived worse. I'd survived growing up in a system that treated Omegas like property. I'd survived foster homes that made this campus gossip look like a minor inconvenience. I'd survived everything life had thrown at me so far. One arrogant Enigma and his entitled followers? That was nothing. I could handle this. I stuck to my routine with stubborn determination. Classes, library, study sessions, then back to my apartment. Simple, predictable, safe. I didn't engage with the whispers or the stares. I just kept my head down and focused on why I was here, to get an education and build a future for myself that didn't depend on anyone else. But Dax apparently had other plans. He was everywhere. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The cafeteria at lunch, sure, he had to eat somewhere. The library during my usual study hours, okay, maybe he actually studied sometimes. The hallway outside my biology classroom, that one was harder to explain away, but I tried. Maybe his biology class is in the same building. Maybe he has a friend in that hallway. Maybe I'm being paranoid. By the third day, though, it was impossible to deny. Dax Rivers was following me. Sometimes he'd make it obvious. Standing where I could see him, those gray eyes tracking my every movement like I was a specimen under a microscope. Other times, I'd just catch glimpses of him at the edge of my vision, a flash of dark hair, the line of his jaw, the expensive cut of his jacket. Always watching, always present. It was creepy and unsettling, and I hated how hyper-aware it made me of everything I did. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, second-guessing my routes through campus, choosing less direct paths just to see if he'd follow. He always did. On Thursday afternoon, I was in the library trying to focus on my biology assignment when I felt him approach. I didn't look up, hoped that if I ignored him, he'd eventually get bored and leave. No such luck. Do you think you're special? His voice cut through the quiet atmosphere of the library like a blade, drawing annoyed looks from nearby students. A girl 2 tables over actually shushed him, realized who she just shushed, and turned the color of a tomato. I carefully closed my textbook, taking my time about it, using those few seconds to compose myself before I looked up at him. He stood over my table with his arms crossed, his expression hovering somewhere between curious and condescending. Like I was a particularly interesting bug he hadn't decided whether to squash yet. "I think you have way too much free time," I replied, keeping my voice cool and detached. "Don't you have anything better to do than harass scholarship students?" His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his skin. For a moment, I thought he might actually get angry, might drop that careful mask of superiority he always wore and show me whatever was underneath. Instead, something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not even an amused one. This was something darker. More dangerous. The kind of smile that sent a shiver down my spine for reasons I didn't want to examine too closely. "I'm starting to like you," he said, his voice dropping lower. "More intimate. This defiance of yours, it's interesting." My stomach twisted uncomfortably. That wasn't a compliment. It was a warning, a declaration of intent. He wasn't going to leave me alone. If anything, my resistance was only making him more determined. I quickly gathered my things, shoving papers and textbooks into my bag with shaking hands. I needed to get out of here. Needed to put distance between us before the situation escalated into something I couldn't control. I stood up and walked away without another word, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But I only made it about halfway to the library exit before panic set in for an entirely different reason. I could feel it. That familiar weakening of the suppressant barrier I maintained around my scent. Like a dam starting to crack. Like a lock beginning to fail. I pressed a hand to my pocket, where I usually kept my emergency blocker inhaler. Empty. No. No. I'd used the last dose this morning and forgotten to refill the prescription. In my defense, I've been a little distracted by the campus-wide harassment campaign and the Enigma who wouldn't stop following me. But excuses didn't matter now. My scent blockers were wearing off, and I was standing in the middle of the library, surrounded by alphas and enigmas who would be able to smell exactly what I was within minutes. My breathing quickened as fear clawed at my chest. If anyone reported me for being on campus without proper suppressants, I could lose my scholarship. Everything I'd worked for. Gone. Because of one stupid mistake. I fumbled through my bag desperately, hoping I'd somehow miss seeing the inhaler. That it had fallen into a side pocket. That I'd find it at the last second, everything would be fine. But there was nothing. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. Dax stood there, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that I could see the way his pupils had blown wide, almost completely black now, swallowing up the gray. His nostrils flared as he breathed in. He knew. He could smell my scent starting to leak through the failing blockers. This scent, his voice was rough, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "This is yours." I took a step backward, my spine hitting the wall behind me with a thud. "Stay away from me." But he moved closer instead, eliminated the distance I tried to create. There was something almost predatory in the way he moved now, all his careful control slipping as his Enigma instincts responded to my uncovered Omega scent. "Omegas aren't allowed on campus without proper suppressants," he said. But there was no triumph in his voice, no satisfaction at catching me in a vulnerable position. If anything, he sounded conflicted. "I could report you right now, you know that?" My heart plummeted. This was it. This was how everything fell apart. I worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and it was going to end because I forgot to refill a prescription. But then Dax did something completely unexpected. He shrugged off his expensive leather jacket, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and draped it over my shoulders in one smooth motion, completely enveloping me in the fabric and his scent. "Put this on," he ordered, his voice firm now. "And tomorrow you better have proper blockers, or we're going to have a real problem." I stared at him in complete confusion, my mind struggling to process what's happening. Why would he help me? Why would he risk his reputation by covering for an Omega who couldn't even manage their own suppressants properly? It made no sense. Went against everything I thought I knew about people like him. But I put on the jacket anyway, because I didn't have a choice. The moment the fabric settled around my shoulders, his scent washed over my senses. Cedarwood and rain and something earthy I couldn't quite name. My Omega instincts immediately calmed, recognizing the scent as safe, as protective. It was a biological response I couldn't control, even as my rational mind screamed warnings. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked away without answering, leaving me standing there wrapped in his jacket, more confused than I'd ever been in my entire life. Dax disappeared after that incident in the library. For 2 solid days, he was nowhere to be found on campus, and his absence felt strangely loud in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. People said he was sick. Some claimed he had important family business to attend to. A few conspiracy theorists whisper that he'd finally snapped and been institutionalized, but that was probably just wishful thinking from people who'd had negative run-ins with him in the past. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself his whereabouts were none of my concern. He was just some arrogant enigma who decided to make my life difficult for no reason. I didn't know him anything just because he'd thrown his jacket at me once. But I kept the jacket. I told myself it was just because I needed to return it, that it would be rude not to give it back clean, that I was being considerate, not whatever else my heart was trying to convince me. I definitely wasn't keeping it because his scent somehow made me feel calmer, safer. I absolutely wasn't burying my face in the collar when I got home at night, breathing in that cedarwood and rain smell until my racing thoughts finally settled enough to let me sleep. That would be weird. That would be pathetic. That would mean something I wasn't ready to admit. I had the jacket professionally cleaned, partly because I was a decent human being, partly because I felt weirdly guilty about the number of times I'd sniffed it and stored it carefully in my locker, checking my phone obsessively for any sign that Dax had returned to campus. When he finally showed up on the 3rd day, I was in the middle of opening my locker when I heard his voice behind me. "Where's my jacket?" I turned to find him standing there, and immediately noticed something was off. His voice sounded hoarse, rougher than usual, and there were faint shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well, like he'd spent the last 2 days wrestling with something he couldn't defeat. He looked tired in a way that made him seem more human, less like the untouchable enigma everyone worshipped and more like just a person. I pulled the jacket from my locker and held it out to him. "It's clean, and thank you for what you did." He took the jacket, but as he reached for it, his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it sent an electric shock up my arm that made me gasp. His eyes widened slightly, and I knew he'd felt it too. That strange, undeniable pull between us that neither of us could explain, like magnets being drawn together against our will. He cleared his throat and changed the subject abruptly. "Do you live alone?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Why do you want to know?" "Just curious." His tone had softened somehow, lost some of that sharp edge of arrogance that usually defined how he spoke. I kept my guard up, unwilling to let him see how much his sudden interest affected me. "Yes, I live alone, and I prefer it that way." He nodded slowly, something thoughtful crossing his expression. Then he turned and walked away without another word. I stood there staring after him, trying to figure out what had just happened and why every interaction with Dax Rivers left me feeling more confused than the last. But over the next few days, I started noticing changes around campus. The whispers and stares that had followed me everywhere suddenly stopped. People who had been deliberately cruel or dismissive now avoided me entirely, giving me a wide berth in hallways and common areas. It was like someone had flipped a switch, transforming me from a target into someone untouchable. When I mentioned it to my friend Milo over coffee one afternoon, he gave me a knowing look that made my stomach drop. Dax put out the word. Milo explained, stirring sugar into his drink with the patience of someone delivering bad news. Nobody touches you. Like, literally nobody. You're under his protection now, whether you wanted it or not. Anger flared hot in my chest. I specifically told Dax I didn't need his help. Didn't want his interference in my life. Who did he think he was, making decisions about my safety without even asking me first? I pulled out my phone and fired off a text before I could second-guess myself. Stop interfering in my life. His response came back almost instantly. Just one word that made my blood pressure spike. No. That was it. I was done being passive about this. The next morning, I tracked Dax down in the cafeteria. He sat surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers and hangers-on, the kind of people who laughed at his jokes a little too loudly and agreed with everything he said. His throne of sycophants. I marched straight up to his table, ignoring the shocked stares from everyone around us. I don't need your protection, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. He looked up at me with an expression of complete calm, like he'd been expecting this confrontation. You don't have a choice in the matter. You're on this campus, which makes you my responsibility. I'm not your anything. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was too frustrated to care about the scene we were making. Let them stare. Let them whisper. I was done being polite about this. His eyes narrowed. But when he spoke, his voice remained controlled and measured. You think I'm trying to own you? That's naive, Eli. Hearing him say my name for the first time did something strange to my heart rhythm. Made it skip and stutter in a way that had nothing to do with anger. How did he even know my name? Had he been asking about me? Researching me? Why? I demanded, my frustration mixing with genuine confusion. Why do you even care what happens to me? For just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even vulnerability. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar mask of confidence and control. When he spoke, his voice had dropped lower. Meant only for me, despite our very public setting. Because if something happened to you, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself. The confession hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about power or territory or any of the usual Enigma dominance games. This was something else. Something deeper and more personal that I didn't know how to process. Before I could formulate a response, he picked up his coffee, stood, and walked away, leaving me standing there in the middle of the cafeteria with everyone staring. I felt frozen. His words echoing in my head on repeat. Because if something happened to you, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself. My heart was doing things it had no business doing. Responding to Dax Rivers in ways I'd sworn I wouldn't allow. This was getting complicated in ways I'd never anticipated when I first arrived at this university. Milo found me later, concern written all over his face. You okay, man? That was pretty intense. I don't know what's happening, I admitted, running my hands through my hair in frustration. Why would he care about protecting me? We barely know each other. We don't even like each other. Are you sure about that last part? Milo asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. Dax Rivers was arrogant, controlling, everything I should stay away from. But he'd also protected me when I was vulnerable. helped me when he could have destroyed my future with a single report. He said things that suggested he cared about my well-being, that I mattered to him for reasons I couldn't understand. And the worst part, some treacherous part of me was starting to care back. Starting to wonder what it would be like to let someone like Dax into my carefully guarded life. Starting to imagine what those gray eyes might look like if they ever softened with genuine affection instead of cold calculation. I was in trouble. Deep, complicated, dangerous trouble. And I had no idea how to get myself out of it. Or if I even wanted to anymore. The following week brought the annual Enigma Alpha Mixer. One of those exclusive campus events that normally wouldn't even register on my radar. Omegas weren't typically on the guest list, which suited me just fine. The last thing I wanted was to spend an evening watching alphas and enigmas peacock around each other like birds trying to impress a mate. But Milo had other ideas about my social life. You need to get out more, he insisted, blocking my path to the library with his considerable alpha bulk. You're always alone, Eli. One night won't kill you. I wanted to argue. To explain that I preferred solitude to the awkward social dynamics of watching enigmas and alphas compete for dominance. That I'd spent years learning to be self-sufficient, and I didn't need to stand around in a fancy room pretending to enjoy small talk with people who'd looked down on me my whole life. But Milo had that determined look in his eyes, the one that meant he wouldn't drop this until I agreed. So I reluctantly gave in, already planning my exit strategy before we even arrived. The venue was decorated with an elegance that screamed money and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over clusters of students dressed in designer suits that probably cost more than my entire semester's worth of textbooks. A string quartet played something classical and vaguely pretentious in the corner. I immediately felt out of place in my simple black shirt and worn jeans, like a stray cat that had wandered into a dog show. Milo abandoned me almost immediately, drawn away by a group of alpha friends near the bar. I retreated to a corner, nursing a glass of punch I had no intention of drinking, and counted down the minutes until I could reasonably leave without Milo guilt-tripping me about it later. 37 minutes. That's a respectable amount of time. I'll stay for 37 minutes and then I'm gone. Then the crowd shifted, creating a natural pathway toward the small stage at the front of the room. Dax appeared, moving through the parted sea of admirers like he owned not just the room but the entire building. Everyone erupted into applause before he'd even said a word, their adoration so thick in the air it was almost suffocating. He took the microphone with practiced ease, launching into a speech about leadership and excellence and the responsibilities that came with power. His voice carried that natural authority that made people lean forward, hang on every word, like he was revealing the secrets of the universe instead of delivering what was essentially a glorified pep talk. I rolled my eyes and took a sip of my punch. Then his eyes found mine across the crowded room. Everything else faded into background noise. The applause, the conversations, the string quartet playing something soft and forgettable in the corner. All of it became distant and unimportant. For several heartbeats, the entire world narrowed down to just the two of us, locked in a moment of connection that I felt all the way down to my bones. I watched his rhythm falter, just for a second. He lost his place in whatever he'd been saying, had to glance down at his note cards to recover his train of thought. Nobody else seemed to notice, too caught up in their worship to see the crack in his perfect facade. But I saw it. I saw how I affected him, how my presence threw off his carefully maintained control. When his speech finally ended to thunderous applause, I decided it was time to make my escape. I fulfilled my obligation to Milo, shown my face at this ridiculous event. Now I could go home to my quiet apartment and try to process whatever had just happened between Dax and me during that loaded eye contact. I was almost to the exit when someone stepped directly into my path. Trent Blackwood. Another campus celebrity, the kind who wasn't quite as powerful as Dax but desperately wanted to be. known for his aggressive pursuit of whatever caught his interest, whether that was academic accolades or people. The smell of alcohol wafted off him in waves, and his eyes had that glazed look of someone who'd had several drinks too many. "You're the one everyone's talking about," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Dax's rumored Omega." I took a careful step backward, trying to maintain distance. "That's just gossip." "It's not true." "Really?" His grin turned predatory, and before I could react, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was too tight, painful enough to make me wince. "Then I guess that means you're available." My Omega instincts kicked into overdrive, flooding my system with panic. "Let go of me." "Right now." But Trent didn't release me. Instead, he pulled me closer, invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. "Why so hostile?" "I'm just trying to be friendly here." Then suddenly, Trent's hand was ripped away from my wrist. Dax stood between us, his entire body radiating a fury so intense it was almost visible. His eyes had gone completely black, no gray left at all. His Enigma aura expanded outward in a wave of dominance that made several nearby people stumble backward. "You touched him." Dax's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more threat than any shout could have. "You actually put your hands on him." Trent's alcohol-induced bravado evaporated in the face of Dax's rage. His face went pale. His hands came up in a placating gesture. "Hey, man, I didn't know he was yours. I was just..." "Leave." The single word carried the weight of an absolute command. The kind of alpha order that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to primal instinct. "If I ever see you near him again, if you so much as look in his direction, I will make sure you regret ever setting foot on this campus." Trent practically ran for the exit, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape. The crowd around us had gone silent, everyone staring at the scene we just created. But Dax didn't seem to notice or care about the audience. His attention was entirely focused on me. He reached for my wrist, the same one Trent had grabbed. His touch was infinitely gentler now as he examined it for bruises. His thumb brushed over my pulse point, and I could feel my heart racing under his skin. Then he laced his fingers through mine and guided me out of the main hall, through a side door that led to a private balcony overlooking the city lights. The cool night air hit my overheated skin, helping to clear some of the adrenaline fog from my brain. Dax stood close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could hear the barely controlled rage still making his breathing uneven. "Are you hurt?" His earlier fury had transformed into something softer, laced with genuine concern that made my chest tighten. I shook my head, though my hand was definitely trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Dax noticed, and without asking permission, he took both of my hands in his, steadying them with his warmth and solid presence. "This is exactly what I've been trying to prevent," he said, his voice low and intense. "Do you understand now? This is why I can't just leave you alone. Why I need to make sure you're protected. I'm not your responsibility." "Yes, you are." He stared directly into my eyes with an intensity that stole my breath. "You might not understand it yet, but you are." What does that even mean? I was so tired of cryptic statements and half-explanations, of feeling like I was stumbling around in the dark while everyone else had a map. He released my hands and took a step back. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." But I couldn't forget. That night, lying in my narrow bed and staring at my apartment ceiling, I replayed every moment on that balcony. The protective fury in his eyes, the gentleness of his touch, the way he looked at me like I was something precious that needed guarding. And for the first time, I let myself wonder if maybe Dax wasn't the villain in my story. Maybe he was something else entirely. Something I was too scared to name. Morning came with news that spread through campus like wildfire. Trent had been suspended. Effective immediately. The official story involved evidence of harassment and violation of the student code of conduct, all of it apparently documented and submitted by Dax himself. I should have been angry about the interference, about Dax taking matters into his own hands without consulting me. Part of me was angry, but a larger part felt something else entirely. Relief, safety, and a gratitude I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. I found Dax outside the chemistry building during the break between classes. Without giving myself time to second guess, I grabbed his arm and pulled him into an empty classroom, shutting the door firmly behind us. "You got Trent suspended," I said, not bothering to frame it as a question. He leaned casually against one of the desks, completely unbothered by my accusatory tone. "Yes? Is that a problem? You can't just control every aspect of my life. Actually, I can, and I will." His expression shifted to something more serious, more determined. "You think this is about control? Or some power trip? But the reality is much simpler. If I don't protect you, you won't be safe. This campus has plenty of people who would target a vulnerable Omega. Then tell me why." I was practically shouting now, all my carefully maintained composure crumbling. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" He went very still. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, like he was physically fighting with himself. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all its usual arrogance. "Because you're my fated mate, Eli, the world stopped spinning." My brain completely short-circuited, unable to process what he just said. Fated mates were supposed to be rare, almost mythical. They were the stuff of romance novels and wishful thinking. Not real life. Not my life. That's not possible," I whispered, backing up until my spine hit the wall. "It is possible. It's reality." He took a step toward me, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. "The night in the library, when your scent broke through your blockers, I knew instantly. Enigmas recognize their destined mates on a biological level. Everything in me knows that you belong with me." My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy. "But I don't want. I know." He cut me off, but not cruelly. His voice was gentle, understanding, in a way I never would have expected from him. "You don't want me. You probably hate me. And I'm not going to force you into anything. That's not what this is about. But I can't change the truth, Eli." He ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time I saw how much this was costing him, how much he was holding back. "That's why I keep trying to stay away from you, trying to give you space. But every time you're in danger, every time someone threatens you, my Enigma side loses control. I can't help it. I can't stop it. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely, overwhelmed by the storm of emotions raging inside me. Fear, confusion, denial. But underneath those was something else. Something I absolutely refused to examine too closely. Without another word, I fled. I ran from that classroom, from the building, from Dax and his impossible confession. I didn't stop until I reached Milo's apartment, pounding on his door until he opened it, still in his pajamas even though it was the middle of the afternoon. "What's wrong?" Milo pulled me inside, concern written all over his face. Everything spilled out of me in a chaotic rush. Dax's confession, the fated mate revelation, my complete inability to process any of it. To his credit, Milo listened to the entire story without interrupting, without judgment. "So, fated mates are actually real," he said when I finally ran out of words. "Apparently so." "Huh? I always thought that was just stories." I slumped onto his couch, emotionally exhausted. "What am I supposed to do, Milo? I don't even know Dax. He's arrogant and controlling, and everything I should avoid. But he's also protected you. Every single time you needed it, Milo pointed out quietly. He hasn't hurt you, Eli. In fact, he's done the opposite. He's kept you safe, even when you told him not to. He sat down beside me, his hand warm on my shoulder. Listen to what your heart is telling you, not just your head. That night, alone in my apartment, I stared at my phone for a solid hour before finally typing out a message to Dax. I need time to think about everything. His response came within seconds, like he'd been waiting for me to reach out. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. I set my phone aside and stared at my ceiling, trying to untangle the mess of feelings inside me. Was what I felt toward Dax just Omega biology responding to an enigma? Or was there something real underneath all the confusion and fear? And more importantly, was I brave enough to find out? 2 weeks passed in a strange sort of limbo. Dax kept his promise. Gave me the space I'd asked for. I saw him around campus, in classes, at the library, in the cafeteria, but he never approached me. He maintained his distance, though I could feel his eyes on me constantly. Always watching, always making sure I was safe. And somewhere during those 2 weeks, something shifted inside me. I started noticing Dax's absence more than his presence. I missed the way he materialized whenever I needed help, how he always seemed to know when something was wrong before I even realized it myself. Missed the security of knowing he was looking out for me, even when I pretended to hate it. Even his annoying habit of showing up everywhere I went had become something I'd grown accustomed to. Something I actually wanted back. The realization that I was falling for him crept up slowly, then hit me all at once like a freight train. I was in love with Dax Rivers, the arrogant campus enigma I'd sworn to hate. I laughed out loud in my empty apartment because the universe had a sick sense of humor. Of course, the one person who was completely wrong for me on paper turned out to be the only person who'd ever made me feel truly seen. Late one evening, I was walking home through the quieter streets near campus when I heard the screech of tires. I looked up. A car came barreling through the intersection, completely ignoring the red light, heading straight for me. I froze. My body locked in fear. My brain screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't listen. The headlights grew brighter, louder, closer. Then someone slammed into me from the side, tackling me out of the car's path. We hit the pavement hard, rolling several times before coming to a stop. I was completely covered by a larger body, protected from the impact. Strong arms wrapped around me, holding me tight. The car sped away, tires squealing, gone before I could even register its color. Eli, are you okay? Dax's voice was frantic. His hands ran over me, checking for injuries. Answer me. Are you hurt? I'm fine, I managed to say, though my entire body was shaking. What about you? That's when I noticed the blood. His arm was scraped raw, a nasty road rash from where it had hit the pavement. There was a cut on his face that was bleeding steadily down his cheek. He'd taken the brunt of our fall, had positioned his body to shield mine from harm. We need to get you to a hospital. I'm fine. You're bleeding. You're safe. That's all that matters. But his arm was clearly injured, and the cut on his face needed attention. I grabbed his uninjured arm with more force than necessary. Hospital. Or my apartment. Choose one. Because you're not walking away from this. He looked surprised by my forcefulness. Then something like amusement flickered across his face. Your apartment. I lived close enough to walk, but it still felt like the longest journey of my life. Supporting most of Dax's weight as we made our way to my building, trying not to think about how right it felt to have him this close. My apartment was small and modest. Nothing like what I imagined Dax was used to. His family probably had mansions and vacation homes and staff to clean up after them. But he didn't comment on the worn furniture or the tiny kitchen or the pile of textbooks on my coffee table. He simply sat where I directed him on my couch, watching me with those intense gray eyes as I retrieved my first aid kit. Cleaning his wounds required me to sit close enough to feel his breath on my skin, to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the ones that only appeared when you were up close enough to notice the way his pulse beat in his throat, fast and steady. He stayed perfectly still the entire time. Didn't even flinch when I applied antiseptic to his scraped arm, though it must have stung like hell. "Thank you," he said softly as I wrapped a bandage around the worst of the scrapes. "Don't thank me. You got hurt because of me." My voice came out rougher than I intended, thick with emotions I couldn't quite name. "No." He caught my hand, stopping my movements. "I got hurt because I chose to protect you. And I'd make that same choice again and again, as many times as necessary. Your safety means everything to me." My throat went tight with unshed tears. I looked into his eyes and saw past all the arrogance and control I'd used as armor against him. I saw vulnerability and pain and genuine care. This wasn't the untouchable campus enigma. This was just Dax, a person who had somehow fallen for me as completely as I'd fallen for him. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you do all this for me?" He took my hand in both of his, cradling it gently. "Because you're the most important person in my life. Fated mate or not, that wouldn't change how I feel." His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand. "I've been in love with you since the first day. When you looked me in the eye and called me entitled, you were the first person who ever saw past my reputation, who treated me like a regular person instead of some untouchable enigma." Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. I never imagined I could love an enigma, especially not someone as seemingly arrogant as Dax Rivers. But when he held my hand like it was something precious, when he laid his heart bare before me, my own heart had no choice but to respond. "I love you too," I said. The words felt both terrifying and right. "I love you, Dax." He pulled me into his arms, holding me tight against his chest like he was afraid I might disappear. I could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and feel the careful way he held me, protective but never possessive. In that moment, I understood. It didn't matter what the rest of the world thought about us. It didn't matter that we'd started as enemies, or that everyone expected me to worship him like they did. We'd chosen each other, not because of fate or biology, but because of what we'd built together. Through every confrontation and moment of vulnerability, every argument and unexpected kindness, this was real. We were real. Epilogue. The next day, when I told Milo everything that had happened, he just laughed and shook his head. Finally, he said with a grin, "I was getting tired of watching you two dance around each other." I smiled back, feeling lighter than I had in weeks, because for the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy. I had Dax, my impossible enigma who'd somehow become my whole world. And he had me, his fated mate who'd chosen to love him, not because destiny demanded it, but because my heart had decided he was worth the risk. The campus still whispered about us, still stared when we walked by holding hands, still couldn't quite believe that the great Dax Rivers had fallen for a scholarship Omega with a chip on his shoulder and a stubborn refusal to bow. But I didn't care anymore. Let them talk. Let them wonder. I had everything I needed right here. Extra story, the heat. 3 months later. The first sign that something was wrong came at 2:47 a.m. I woke up drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around my legs like they were trying to trap me. My skin felt too tight, too hot, like someone had cranked the thermostat to hell and then broken the dial. No. Asterisk, no. Asterisk. I pressed a shaking hand to my forehead, burning up. I checked my phone. The suppressant tracking app told me my next dose wasn't due for another week. I've been careful. So careful. Double-checking every pill, every injection, every single measure I'd put in place to prevent exactly this from happening. But my body didn't care about my carefully laid plans. I was going into heat, early, unexpected, and absolutely terrifying. I'd spent years training myself to handle preheat symptoms, the fever, the restlessness, the way my omega instincts started clawing at the inside of my skull, demanding things I couldn't give them. I had protocols, emergency supplies stashed in my bathroom cabinet, a whole system for riding out a heat alone, because I'd never had anyone to share one with and I never wanted to. But this time was different. Because this time, as the first real wave of heat crashed over me, my entire body ached for something, someone specific. Dex. His name echoed through my feverish mind like a prayer. My omega instincts, usually so controlled, so trained, were screaming at me with a primal urgency I'd never experienced before. Asterisk, where is he? Why isn't he here? He should be here. He needs to be here, asterisk. I curled into a ball on my soaked sheets, trying to breathe through the wave of need that threatened to drown me. My apartment felt too empty, too quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, fast and desperate. Asterisk, I can do this alone. I've always done this alone, asterisk. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. Things had changed. I had changed. 3 months of being with Dax, of learning his scent, his touch, the way his presence made my omega instincts purr with contentment, had rewired something fundamental inside me. My body no longer knew how to survive a heat without him. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I lunged for it with trembling hands, nearly knocking it to the floor. Dax, you're awake. Good. I'm outside. My heart stopped. How did he know? I stumbled out of bed, my legs barely cooperating, and made my way to the window. Peered through the blinds. There he was. Dax stood in the parking lot below, phone in hand, looking up at my window like he'd known exactly where to find me. Even from 3 floors up, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were shoved deep in his pockets, like he was physically restraining himself from doing something reckless. I fumbled with my phone, nearly dropping it twice before I managed to type out a response. Eli, how did you know? Dax, I felt it. Woke up out of a dead sleep. Couldn't breathe. Knew something was wrong with you. Dax, Eli, I need to come up there. Please. I stare at the screen, my vision blurring as another wave of heat washed through me. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to say no, to protect myself, to maintain the independence I'd fought so hard for. But my omega instincts, the ones I'd spent years suppressing, ignoring, pretending didn't exist, were screaming louder. Eli, 3rd floor. Apartment 3B. The lock is broken. Just push. I barely made it back to the bed before the door swung open. Dax stood in the doorway, and the moment his eyes landed on me, curled up on the bed, flushed and trembling and desperate, something shifted in his expression. His pupils blew wide, swallowing up the gray, until his eyes were almost completely black. Eli. His voice was rough, strained, like he was holding himself back by a thread. You should go, I managed to say, even though every fiber of my being was begging him to come closer. I can handle this alone. I've done it before. No. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside the bed, so we were eye level. His hand hovered near my face, not quite touching, like he was asking permission. You're not doing this alone. Not anymore. Dax, I can smell you from across the room, Eli. Every instinct I have is screaming at me to take care of you, to make this better. And I will, but only if you want me here. Only if you choose me. His gray eyes searched mine, raw and vulnerable in a way I'd only seen a handful of times. So tell me, do you want me to stay? The tears that spilled down my cheeks were from more than just the heat. Yes, I whispered. Please, please stay. The moment the words left my mouth, something shifted between us. Dax's careful restraint crumbled. He surged forward, cupping my face in his hands, and kissed me like I was the only thing keeping him alive. His lips were warm and sure, and the scent of him, cedarwood and rain and something darker, something mine, flooded my senses and made my omega instincts purr with satisfaction. Asterisk finally. Finally. Finally asterisk. His hands moved down my body, learning every curve, every shiver, every place that made me gasp against his mouth. He was gentle when he needed to be, firm when I craved it, and through it all, he never stopped whispering against my skin. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. You're so beautiful like this. Mine? You're mine. And I let him take care of me. For the first time in my life, I let someone else carry the weight. Let someone else be strong when I couldn't. I stopped fighting my instincts and surrendered to the feeling of being held, being wanted, being loved in a way I'd never allowed myself to believe I deserved. The heat lasted 3 days. 3 days of fever and need and Dax refusing to leave my side. He brought me water when I was too weak to stand. Helped me through the worst of the cramps. Made sure I ate even when food was the last thing on my mind. And when the fever finally broke and I emerged from the haze, exhausted but safe, he was still there. How are you feeling? Dax's voice was soft as he ran a cool cloth over my forehead. We were tangled together in my narrow bed, sheets a mess around us, the morning light filtering through my cheap blinds. Like I got hit by a truck, I admitted. But good. Really good, actually. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that he only ever showed me, and pressed a kiss to my temple. You scared me, you know, when I felt it from across town. I've never run so fast in my life. You felt it. The bond. He shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It's stronger now than it was before. When you're in distress, I know. When you're scared, I know. When you need me. He trailed off, his thumb tracing circles on my hip. I always know. I turned my face into his chest, breathing in his scent, letting it calm the last lingering tremors of my heat. I was so scared, I admitted quietly. Before you got here, I thought I could handle it alone, like I always have, but my body wouldn't listen. It just kept screaming for you. Good. He tilted my chin up, so I had to look at him. Because I'll always come, Eli. Every single time. You don't ever have to face anything alone again. That's a big promise. I'm a big guy. I laughed, actually laughed, and the sound surprised both of us. It felt good. Like something inside me had finally loosened after years of being wound too tight. I love you, I said, because it was true. Because after 3 days of being completely vulnerable with him, there was no point in pretending otherwise. I love you too, he replied, like it was the easiest thing in the world. Now go back to sleep. You need to recover. Stay. Always. When I woke up again hours later, Dax was in my tiny kitchen. I shuffled out of the bedroom, still wrapped in one of his hoodies, the same one from that first day in the library, I realized with a jolt of nostalgia, and found him attempting to cook. The results were ambitious. What are you doing? Making you soup. That doesn't look like soup. It's artisanal. I peered into the pot. Whatever was inside was definitely not soup. It was also definitely not edible. Dax, did you just throw random ingredients into a pot? I followed a recipe. Which recipe? The one on the back of the broth container. I looked at the empty container in the trash. It was for beef broth. Whatever he'd added to it included vegetables, what looked like half a bag of rice, and something that might have been cinnamon. You put cinnamon in beef soup? It said, add spices to taste. I like cinnamon. I stared at him. He stared back, completely unrepentant. And despite everything, Despite the exhaustion and the lingering heat symptoms and the fact that my kitchen now smelled like a cursed potion, I felt my heart swell with so much love I thought it might burst. "We're ordering pizza," I announced. "But I made soup." "We're ordering pizza, Dax." He sighed dramatically, like I was asking him to make an enormous sacrifice. But when he pulled out his phone to place the order, he was smiling. Later, curled up on the couch together with pizza boxes on the coffee table and some bad reality show playing on my laptop, Dax spoke again. "Move in with me." I nearly choked on my slice. "What?" "Move in with me," he repeated, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Your apartment is too small. The lock on your door is broken. And next time you go into heat, I want you somewhere safe. Somewhere ours. Dax, we've only been together for 3 months. I've known you were mine since the first day of class, Eli. The timeline doesn't matter." He set down his pizza and turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. "I'm not asking because I want to control you. I'm asking because I want to take care of you. There's a difference." I looked at our intertwined fingers, at the way his hands dwarfed mine, warm and steady, at the matching bite marks on his neck, one from each of the last 3 days, that Markham has claimed. "I don't know how to live with someone," I admitted quietly. "I've been alone for so long. I don't know if I'm good at sharing space, sharing myself. Then we'll learn together." He squeezed my hands. "I'm not exactly a pro at this either, Eli. Before you, I didn't let anyone close. You're the first person who's ever seen the real me. The first person I've wanted to see it. What if I mess up? Then you mess up, and I'll still be here. What if you get tired of me? Impossible. What if?" He kissed me, soft and slow and thorough, until all the what-ifs melted away. "I love you," he said against my lips. "Not because I have to. Not because of fate or biology or any of that. Because you, the stubborn, sarcastic, fiercely independent person who told me I was entitled on our first day. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." "That's very cheesy." "You love it." I did. "Fine," I said. "I'll move in with you. But I'm keeping my own space. A room that's just mine. For when I need to be alone. Whatever you want. And you have to let me decorate it however I want. Within reason." "No, Dax. However I want." He sighed, but he was smiling. "Fine. However you want. And you're never allowed to cook again." "That's fair." I leaned into him, letting his warmth surround me, letting myself finally believe that this was real, that he was real. "I love you too," I whispered, "even though you put cinnamon in beef soup. You'll miss my cooking when I'm gone. You're never leaving, remember?" He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "Never." Then,